The child was crying into the snow, and no one stopped. Hazel noticed this the way she noticed most things, quietly, from the edge of things, where Omegas learned to live if they wanted to survive. She had been crossing the outer courtyard of Varenhold's market with a basket of dried herbs pressed against her hip, her gray wool cloak pulled tight against the bitter wind that rolled down from the northern peaks. The sky overhead was the color of old iron, heavy with clouds that had not yet decided whether to give more snow or simply threaten it. Her breath fogged in small white bursts before her, and the cobblestones beneath her worn leather boots were slick with a thin glaze of ice. She should have kept walking. Every instinct shaped by 23 years of life as an Omega in a kingdom ruled by alpha blood told her to keep her eyes forward, her head low, her feet moving. Do not attract attention. Do not linger. Do not make yourself memorable. And yet, the boy was small, perhaps 5 or 6 winters, no more, sitting half-hidden behind a stone merchant's post at the far edge of the courtyard. He wore a tunic of fine black wool, far too fine for the cold, and his dark braided hair had come half undone around his face. He was not wailing the way children did when they wanted something. He was crying the other way, silently, with his knees pulled to his chest and his small shoulders shaking in uneven tremors. The kind of crying that comes when a child has already learned that no one is coming. Hazel stopped walking. Around her, the market churned on. A beta merchant called out prices for salted pork. 2 gamma guards in boiled leather strode past the child without a glance. A woman in a fur-trimmed mantle steered her own children away from him as though loneliness were something that could spread. Hazel set her basket down against the post and crouched until she was at the boy's level. "Hey," she said softly. "Not are you all right?" She already knew he wasn't. "What's your name?" He looked up. His eyes were startling. Pale gray-blue, rimmed red from crying, and far too serious for a child's face. There was something in those eyes that made her chest ache in a way she could not name. "Kale," he whispered. "Kale." She said it the way her mother had once said her own name, like it mattered, like it deserved space in the air. "I'm Hazel. Are you lost?" He shook his head once, quickly. Then, after a pause that seemed too long for someone so small, "Father is busy." She glanced around the courtyard again. No one was looking for a child. No frantic nurse. No searching guard. Just the indifferent crowd and the wind pulling at cloaks and banners. "Is he nearby?" she asked. Kale gave a small, uncertain shrug, and something in that gesture, the way his shoulders rose and fell with all the helplessness of someone who genuinely did not know, made her decision for her. She pulled the gray cloak from her own shoulders, the warmth of it immediately stolen by the cold air biting at her linen dress, and she wrapped it around the boy in one careful motion, tucking it at his chin the way she had once done for the younger children in the Omega ward when winter came and there were never enough blankets. He blinked at her, startled. "It's too cold to sit on stone without a cloak," she told him simply. "Won't you be cold?" "I'm warm enough." A lie, but a small and kind one. She pulled her knees up beside him and settled against the merchant's post, feeling the frozen grit of the stone seep through her dress. "Would you like to hear something? To pass the time while we wait for your father?" Kale looked at her for a long moment, with that unnerving gravity of his, as though measuring her. Then he gave a single, solemn nod. She thought for a moment. Then she began telling him the old story her mother had told her, the tale of the silver wolf of the northern pass, who was neither alpha nor omega nor beta, but something older, something that ran between the cracks of the world's order and belonged only to the wind. It was not a grand story. There were no battles in it, no throne rooms, just a wolf who ran alone until the night it found a frozen river and sat beside it until spring came, and the river, grateful, sang to it all summer long. She told it quietly, her voice low enough that it would not carry, her hands moving occasionally in small gestures when the words needed help. And slowly, so slowly she almost did not notice, the small body beside her uncurled. Kale leaned, inch by inch, until his dark head was resting against her arm, the gray cloak wrapped around both of them now like a small tent against the wind. She did not move. She barely breathed. She thought, absurdly, that she could feel his heartbeat settling. She did not see the figure at the edge of the courtyard. She would not have recognized him even if she had. She had never been to court, never stood close enough to the great keep of Varenhold to see the banners clearly. She was an Omega hedge healer from the lower village. The name Xander Draveth, Alpha King of the Northern Reaches, was something that existed in the same distant register as winter storms and the movements of stars. Present, powerful, entirely beyond her world. But he was there. He stood in the shadow of the archway that opened from the keep's outer corridor into the market courtyard, flanked by 2 guards who had gone still and silent at his silent signal. He wore black leather armor crossed with dark straps at the chest, a heavy fur mantle across his broad shoulders, and his dark hair, long braided back, was touched by the cold wind. His eyes, the same pale gray blue that his son had inherited, were fixed on the scene with an expression that no one at court would have recognized. Because it was not command. It was not the cold authority that every soul in Varenhold knew to fear. It was something quieter than that, something that had no name in the language of kings. He had come out to retrieve Cale himself, dismissing the nurses, dismissing the guard, because the boy had slipped away again, as he so often did, seeking something that the great stone walls of the keep could not give him. Xander had been irritated when he stepped into the courtyard. He had been ready to be the firm, efficient father that duty demanded. Then he had seen her, an Omega woman, slight in her linen dress, sitting on frozen cobblestones with his son tucked against her side, telling him a story about a silver wolf, her voice barely audible above the wind. She had given the boy her cloak. She was visibly cold, her arms tight, her breath coming faster than it should. And she had not once looked around the courtyard to see who might be watching, had not performed her kindness for any audience. She had simply done it. Xander stood in the archway for a long time, long enough to hear the end of the story, the wolf and the river and the singing summer, long enough to watch Cale's rigid little shoulders drop into something that the court healers had spent months trying to achieve with tinctures and gentle encouragements, long enough to feel something shift in his chest that he did not have a name for and was not, in this moment, willing to examine. When she finally looked up, sensing perhaps the weight of being watched, she looked directly at him. And for just a moment, Hazel of the lower village and Xander, Alpha King of the Northern Reaches, looked at each other across a courtyard full of people who saw neither of them. Then his guard stepped forward, and the expression on her face, the open, unguarded warmth that had been there a moment before, went very, very still. The guards moved the way all royal guards moved, with the specific, practiced weight of men who had learned that their presence alone was supposed to end things before they began. They stepped into the courtyard in matching strides, and the crowd parted around them without being asked, the way water parts around stone. Hazel rose to her feet slowly. Not quickly. She had learned long ago that sudden movements around armed men were rarely wise, but with a steadiness she did not entirely feel. Her hands were cold. She had not realized how cold until this moment, when she had nothing to do with them, and the absence of Cale's warmth beside her made the wind feel sharper. She kept her eyes low, as was proper for an Omega facing armed Gamma guards. She knew the protocol. Everyone in the lower village knew it. But then a third set of footsteps crossed the courtyard, slower than the guards, deliberate, and the quality of the silence that followed those footsteps was entirely different. Not the silence of a crowd making way out of habit, but the silence of people who had stopped breathing. She made herself look up. He was taller than she had registered from across the courtyard. The fur mantle on his shoulders was black wolf pelt, deep and dense, and his leather armor caught the dull winter light in a way that made him look carved from the same dark stone as the keep behind him. The braids in his dark hair were bound with small iron rings. His jaw was set, his expression unreadable, and his pale gray-blue eyes, Cale's eyes, she realized with a start, Cale's exact eyes, were fixed on her with an attention that felt physical, like pressure against her sternum. She had just been sitting on frozen cobblestones telling stories to the Alpha King's son. She had wrapped the Alpha King's son in her cloak. The cloak was still around Cale's shoulders. Hazel felt the full weight of this understanding arrive all at once, and it took everything she had not to take a step backward. Cale, apparently feeling no such paralysis, stood up from the cobblestones and crossed to his father without hurry, trailing the gray wool cloak behind him like a small shadow. He stopped at Xander's side and looked up at him. "She told me about the Silver Wolf," Cale said, with the solemn directness that Hazel was already beginning to recognize as simply the way this child spoke. "The one that waits by the frozen river." Xander looked down at his son. Something moved across his face, too fast to read, gone before it fully formed. Then he looked back at Hazel. "Your name," he said. It was not precisely a question. "Hazel, my lord." She kept her voice even. "Of the lower village. I meant no presumption. The child was cold, and you gave him your cloak." "Yes, my lord." A pause. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of pine smoke from somewhere in the market, and the faint metallic tang of the cold itself. "You are a healer," he said. Not a question either, this time. His gaze had moved briefly to the basket she had set against the post, the dried bundles of yarrow and shepherd's purse and feverwort visible above the rim. "A hedge healer, my lord. I serve the lower village and the Omega Quarter." Another pause. She could not read him. His face was not cruel. That, at least, she could say. But it was sealed in a way that felt like a different kind of fortress entirely, walls built from the inside rather than the out. Then he said, "The cloak." For a disoriented moment, she did not understand. Then Cale solemnly unwrapped the gray wool from his shoulders and held it out to her, and she stepped forward to take it. And in the transaction of that small exchange, she was close enough to the Alpha King to see the faint scar that ran along his jaw, a thin white line from cheekbone toward chin, old and long-healed. "Thank you," Xander said, quietly, almost as though the words had surprised him by existing. Hazel nodded, folded the cloak over her arm, and retrieved her basket. She was preparing the careful, invisible exit she had spent a lifetime perfecting, the smooth disappearance of someone who has learned that the best outcome in powerful company is simply to cease being noticed. When Cale spoke again, "Will you come back tomorrow?" The silence that followed was of a different texture entirely. Hazel looked at the boy. He was watching her with those serious gray eyes, no performance in them, no calculation. Just a simple and devastating hope. She looked at Xander. She could not help it. And for just a fraction of a second, the sealed expression cracked. Not into warmth, exactly, but into something adjacent to it. Something that watched her and waited. "That is not my decision to make," she said carefully, addressing Cale but still aware of his father's gaze. "I'm only a village healer." "I will send word," Xander said. She blinked. "My lord, to the Omega Quarter, if I have use for a healer at the keep." He said it with the flat practicality of a man accustomed to making decisions that needed no decoration. He had already turned away, one hand resting briefly on Cale's shoulder to guide him back toward the archway. "You will be compensated fairly." And then he was gone, back into the shadow of the keep's corridor, Cale walking beside him. And at the very last moment before they passed through the archway, the boy looked back over his shoulder and raised one small hand in a wave that was so unexpectedly childlike that it made Hazel's throat tighten without warning. She stood in the emptying courtyard for a moment longer than she should have. Then she pulled the gray cloak around her own shoulders, picked up her basket, and walked back toward the lower village with her eyes forward, and her mind anything but quiet. She told no one. The Omega Quarter was not a cruel place, not by the standards of the kingdom at any rate. But it was a place where information moved the way water did, finding every crack, and Hazel had no desire to be the subject of speculation. She shared a narrow stone dwelling with an older Omega woman named Petra, who had been a midwife for 30 years and had the particular gift of seeing through pretense that long practice with laboring women tends to produce. Petra was stirring something over the hearth fire when Hazel came in, and she looked up once, looked at Hazel's face, and said nothing. Which was, Hazel had long ago learned Petra's way of saying "I notice," and "I am waiting." Hazel hung her cloak on the iron hook by the door, set her basket on the preparation table, and began sorting the herbs with hands that had almost stopped shaking. "Cold out," Petra said to the pot. "Very," Hazel agreed, to the yarrow. A comfortable silence. The fire crackled. The smell of lentil broth and wood smoke filled the low-ceilinged room, and outside, the wind pressed against the shuttered window like something patient and relentless. "You've got that look," Petra said eventually. "What look?" "The one where you've seen something you don't know what to do with yet." Hazel set down the bunch of feverwort in her hand. She thought about the boy on the cobblestones, and the cloak, and the gray-blue eyes, both pairs of them, and the quiet, weightless moment in the courtyard when she had looked up and found herself being seen by someone who had no reason whatsoever to see her. "I will send word." "It's nothing," she said. Petra made a sound that was not agreement and was not argument, and went back to her stirring, and Hazel went back to her sorting, and the fire kept burning, and outside the sky finally made its decision and let the snow come down. She did not sleep well. She told herself it was the cold. The stone walls of the dwelling held the winter in their bones, long past sunset, and her blanket was thin, and these were ordinary and sufficient explanations. She did not let herself think about pale gray eyes, or the word tomorrow spoken in a child's voice, careful and hopeful, and entirely unaware of what it asked. She did not let herself think about the Alpha King's voice saying, "Thank you," quietly, almost against his will, as though gratitude were a language he had learned from a book, rather than spoken aloud often enough to make it natural. She did not let herself think about any of it. But in the morning, when the knock came at the door of the Omega dwelling, sharp, official, the knock of a royal messenger, Petra opened it before Hazel could rise from the preparation table, and the young Gamma in the keep's livery held out a folded parchment sealed in black wax. Petra took it without a word, and brought it to Hazel, and set it on the table between them without a word. Hazel looked at the seal. A wolf, mid-stride, beneath a crown. Her hands were perfectly steady when she broke it. Inside, in a handwriting that was angular and economical, and left no flourishes anywhere, "The keep requires a healer. Report to the inner gate at dawn, 3 days hence. Ask for Gregor. No signature, no title. None was necessary." Petra looked at the parchment, then at Hazel, then back at the parchment. "It's nothing," she said, in a tone that made the word mean its complete opposite. Hazel folded the parchment carefully along its original crease. She did not disagree. The inner gate of Varenhold Keep smelled of iron and old stone, and the particular cold that only places built to endure centuries ever carry. A cold that was less about temperature and more about depth, as though the chill lived in the walls themselves, and had simply always been there, patient and permanent. Hazel arrived before dawn, as instructed. She had worn her best dress, which was not by any court standard a fine thing. Undyed linen, clean and mended at the left sleeve where it had caught on a bramble the previous autumn. Her gray cloak. Her hair braided back in the single plait she always wore when she was working, golden and neat against her neck. She carried her healer's satchel, the worn leather one with the brass buckle her mother had given her, packed with the things she knew how to use. Poultices and dried herbs, a small knife for lancing, needle and thread, a clay pot of drawing salve, vials of tincture stopped with wax. She looked, she knew, exactly what she was. And she had decided, somewhere between the sleepless hours and the gray pre-dawn walk through the lower village, that this was not something to apologize for. Gregor turned out to be a broad, weathered beta of perhaps 50 winters, with a gray beard trimmed close, and the permanently skeptical expression of a man who had spent decades managing the movement of people in and out of a royal keep, and had seen enough to be impressed by almost nothing. He looked at Hazel in the torchlight of the inner gate with the specific assessment of someone cataloging an unfamiliar object. "Hedge healer," he said, not unkindly but with no warmth either. "From the lower village." "Yes." "You're to attend the young Lord Kale when called upon. The keep has its own healer. Old Bram. He handles wounds and fevers and the like. You're not replacing him." He said this with a firmness that suggested it had been a point of some internal debate. "The young lord has not been sleeping. He won't eat properly. He's been given to sitting alone in corners, which the king finds—" He paused, selecting a word. "Concerning." Hazel thought of the cobblestones and the small shaking shoulders. "I understand," she said. Gregor studied her for another moment. Then he said, "You'll be given a room in the servants' wing. You'll take meals in the lower hall. You will not wander the keep unescorted. You will not speak to the king unless he speaks to you first." He paused again. "Those are not my rules. Those are old rules. They apply to everyone. I know how to be where I'm supposed to be," Hazel said quietly. Something shifted in Gregor's expression. Not quite approval, but a loosening of the suspicion. He gave a short nod and turned to lead her through the gate. The keep was vast in the way that things built by successive generations of powerful men tend to be vast. Not elegant exactly, but overwhelming, accumulated. Each corridor and hall layered over an older one, until the whole structure felt like a living argument between centuries. Torches burned in iron brackets along the walls. The floors were wide stone flags worn smooth by countless feet. Tapestries hung at intervals, depicting battles and hunts and wolves mid-leap against dark skies, their dye faded by smoke, and years into something that felt less like decoration and more like memory. Gregor showed her the servants' wing, a corridor of small stone rooms near the kitchens, where the warmth of the ovens reached faintly through the walls. Her room held a narrow bed with a wool blanket, a table, a stool, and a candle. She set her satchel on the table and stood in the small space for a moment, adjusting to it the way she adjusted to all new spaces. By breathing the air, taking in the smell of the stone and the tallow candle and the faint bread warmth from the kitchen below. She had lived in smaller places. She had been colder. She reminded herself of both. She met Kale again on the second morning. He was in the keep's inner garden, a square of frost-killed grass surrounded by high stone walls, where a bare-branched pear tree stood in the corner like a patient old man. He was sitting under the pear tree with a carved wooden wolf in his hands, turning it over and over in a repetitive way that suggested he was not really looking at it. He looked up when she came through the archway, and something in his face shifted. Not the spectacular lighting up of a child seeing a favorite thing, but something quieter and almost cautious, as though hope were a thing he had learned to ration. "You came," he said. "I did." She crossed the frost-stiff grass and sat down on the stone bench nearest the pear tree. "Not too close. Not too far. That's a fine wolf." He looked down at the carving. "Father made it." A pause. "He makes things sometimes, when he can't sleep." Hazel absorbed this piece of information carefully and said nothing about it. "Gregor tells me you haven't been eating much," she said instead. Kale gave a small shrug. "The food in the great hall is loud." She blinked. "Loud?" "Everyone watches when I eat." He said it simply, as though reporting a weather condition. "I don't like being watched." She looked at him. This small, grave child with his Alpha King's eyes and his too serious face, sitting alone under a dead tree in the middle of a vast stone fortress. And she thought, "Of course you don't. You've been alone in the middle of a crowd your entire short life." "I could eat with you," she said. "If you'd like, in the lower hall. It's quieter there." He considered this with the solemnity he brought to all things. Then, "Are you going to try to make me talk about my feelings? The last woman they sent did that. She kept asking me how things made me feel." He frowned. I don't always know how things make me feel." "Neither do I," Hazel said honestly. "I usually just try to figure out what to do next instead." A silence. The wind moved through the pear tree's bare branches with a dry, papery sound. "That's better," Cale said. She did not see the king for 4 days. She was aware of him the way one is aware of weather, as something large and present that shaped conditions without being directly visible. She heard him once, through a corridor wall, his voice low and carrying the specific weight of command, though she could not make out the words. She saw the way the guards straightened when he moved through a passage. She saw it in Gregor's face whenever the king's name came up. A tightening, not of fear exactly, but of a man who carried significant responsibility seriously. She focused on Cale. They fell into a routine with the ease of two people who were both, in their separate ways, accustomed to finding quiet corners in noisy worlds. Mornings in the inner garden, when the cold was bearable and the light came over the eastern wall in long pale slats. She would bring something from the kitchen, bread, dried fruit, sometimes a piece of soft cheese, and they would sit under the pear tree, and she would tell stories, or he would ask questions, which he did with an unsettling precision. "Why do omegas live separately?" he asked one morning, without preamble, turning the carved wolf over in his hands. She was quiet for a moment. "Old rules," she said, which was true, and also the fullest answer she could give, without entering territory that was not safe to enter with the Alpha King's child. "Father says old rules should be examined." Cale looked at her sideways. "He said that to Gregor once. I heard through the door." Hazel looked at the frost on the ground and said nothing. "Do you think they should?" Cale pressed. "Be examined?" "I think," she said carefully, "that your father is in a better position than I am to answer that." Cale seemed to accept this, though the small furrow between his brows suggested he had filed the question away for future use. It was on the 5th morning that she came through the inner garden archway, and found it was not only Cale waiting under the pear tree. Xander stood at the far wall with his back to her, looking up at the eastern sky where the pale winter sun was just clearing the stone. He was without his guards, without his fur mantle, just the dark leather armor and the cross straps at his chest, and the braided hair bound with its iron rings. He looked, in this private moment, less like a monument and more like a man, broader than she remembered, more tired somehow, in the set of his shoulders. Cale was on the bench with his wolf, watching his father with an expression that mixed pride and uncertainty and longing in proportions that made Hazel's chest ache. She almost retreated. She had her foot half-turned when Xander spoke, without turning around. "The pear tree blooms in late spring," he said. "I used to think it was dead the first time I saw it. My father told me that was the point, learning to wait for what isn't gone." A pause. "He was not generally a wise man," Xander continued, still to the sky. "But he was right about that." Hazel stood in the archway, and did not know what to do with her hands or her breathing, or the strange suspended quality of the moment. Then Xander turned, and looked at her with those pale gray eyes and said, "You've been good for him." It was a statement so simple and so unexpected that she felt it land somewhere behind her ribs before her mind had properly processed it. "He's good for himself," she said. "He just needed somewhere quiet enough to be it." Something crossed Xander's face, there and gone, that same unnamed thing she had caught in the courtyard. He glanced at Cale, who was pretending to study his wolf carving with unconvincing focus, while clearly listening to every word. "Walk with me," Xander said, to her, and Hazel, who had spent 23 years learning to disappear, followed the Alpha King through his own keep and into the unknown territory of his attention. He walked without the ceremony that followed him everywhere else in the keep. No guards at his heels. No Gregor appearing at doorways with scrolls and concerns. Just the two of them moving through a corridor Hazel had not yet been shown, one that ran along the keep's northern face and had windows, narrow, unshuttered slits in the stone that looked out over the valley below, where the lower village sat in the gray morning like a handful of stones scattered by a careless hand. Hazel kept a respectful distance, half a step behind and to his left, and told herself this was simply appropriate protocol and not a way of keeping enough space to breathe properly. Xander walked slowly, for a man of his size, as though he had made a deliberate decision about his pace and was holding to it. "Gregor tells me Cale ate a full meal yesterday," he said, in the lower hall. "He did, 2 portions of barley porridge and most of a bread roll." She paused. "He negotiated the second portion himself. He told the cook it was for medicinal purposes." Something shifted at the corner of Xander's mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the shadow a smile casts before it arrives. "He learned that from me. Negotiating with cooks? Framing what you want as a necessity." He glanced at her sideways. "It works better than you'd think." She said nothing, but filed it away. This small, unexpected piece of him. They reached a wider space where the corridor opened into a kind of alcove, a deep window seat carved into the stone with a view of the valley that was, in the pale morning light, genuinely beautiful. The snow on the distant hills caught the sun at an angle that made it look almost warm. Below, the smoke of the lower village rose in thin, peaceful columns. Xander stopped at the window. He looked out for a moment before he spoke. "His mother died when he was 2 winters old," he said. No preamble, no softening. "Fever. It came fast, and it did not ask permission." A pause, during which the wind moved outside the window, and the valley smoke bent and recovered. "He does not remember her, but he knows the shape of the absence." Hazel stood very still. "I know how to rule," Xander continued, his voice carrying the same flat precision she was beginning to understand, was not coldness, but the sound of a man choosing words with great care because he knew the damage imprecise words could cause. "I know how to command and adjudicate and negotiate, and when necessary, fight. I was taught these things thoroughly." He turned from the window. "I was not taught how to help a child who sits alone under a dead tree because the hall is too loud." The honesty of it struck her like cold water, unexpected, clarifying. She thought carefully before she spoke. "You made him the wolf," she said. Xander looked at her. "The carving. He told me you make things when you can't sleep." She kept her voice even. "That is not a man who doesn't know how to be a father. That is a man who loves his son in the language he has and is trying to learn more." The silence that followed was long enough that she began to wonder if she had overstepped, if the brief, corridor-specific truce of this walk had boundaries she had just pressed past. She was an Omega hedge healer. She had just made an observation about the emotional life of the Alpha King of the Northern Reaches. But Xander did not look offended. He looked, she thought, as though someone had said something in a language he recognized but had not heard spoken aloud in a very long time. "You say things directly," he said. "I find it saves time. Most people do not speak directly to me. Most people are afraid of you. And you are not." She considered lying. It would have been the sensible choice. But she had already established a pattern in this conversation, and abandoning it now would be more conspicuous than continuing it. "I am cautious of you," she said, "which is different." He studied her. In the northern light from the window, his eyes were the color of the sky just before snow, that particular pale gray blue that is less a color than a quality of light itself. Cautious how? "You are powerful, and I am not. That creates a natural asymmetry that only a fool ignores." She met his gaze steadily. "But I don't believe you are cruel. Cale is too kind for a child raised by a cruel man." Something moved through Xander's expression at that. Something that arrived too quickly for her to catalog and was gone before she could name it, leaving only a slight tightening at his jaw that might have been feeling, or might have been the effort to contain it. He turned back to the window. "There is a council meeting in 3 days," he said, and the shift in his tone was the shift of a man closing a door, not slamming it, just firmly returning it to its frame. Lords from the Eastern Territories. They come every winter solstice to discuss border matters and taxation and the usual theater of governance. A pause. They also come to remind me that Cale has no mother, and that an unmated Alpha King is, in their view, a political instability. She understood what he was telling her, and she understood also that she was not supposed to comment on it. She was simply, she thought, being informed of the shape of his world, as a courtesy. Or perhaps because speaking it aloud to someone who had no stake in it was the closest he could come to speaking it honestly. I will make sure Cale is occupied and comfortable during the council days, she said. He shouldn't have to feel that particular pressure. Xander looked at her sharply. How did you know that was what You mentioned it immediately after talking about him. She kept her voice gentle. You were telling me two things at once. I only responded to the one that was actually a request. A long silence. You are very observant, he said, and she could not tell if it was an accusation or an admiration, and suspected it might be both. The council arrived on a bitter afternoon 2 days later, when the sky was the color of pewter, and the first hard snowfall of the deep winter came down in curtains that turned the world white and muffled. Hazel heard them before she saw them. A cavalcade of horses and voices and the clinking of metal, the sound of important men who had traveled far and intended to be felt upon arrival. She watched from the narrow window of the servants' corridor as the lords of the Eastern Territories rode through the main gate in fur-trimmed mantles and polished boots, attended by their own guards and servants, and the general atmosphere of people accustomed to having the world rearrange itself for them. She did not like them. She tried to be fair about this. She did not know them, had no specific reason beyond instinct. But instinct, in her experience, was a thing worth listening to. She found Cale in the inner garden, despite the snow, sitting under the pear tree with a dusting of white on his dark hair, as though he were trying to become part of the landscape. They're here, he said, when she came through the archway. I know. She shook the snow from her cloak and sat beside him on the bench, close enough that their arms touched. The cold was sharp, but bearable if you stopped fighting it. They always look at me like a problem to be solved, Cale said. That's because they're looking at a throne, not a child. She kept her voice matter of fact. That says something about them, not about you. He was quiet for a moment, then, Lord Saval asked Father last year if he was going to take a new mate. Right in front of me. His voice was very controlled, the way children's voices get when they are managing something that adults have not noticed needs managing. As though I were a piece of furniture. Hazel's jaw tightened. What did your father say? She asked, carefully. Cale's mouth curved, and it was, she realized, the first time she had seen him smile. Small and sideways, very like his father. He said that Lord Saval's opinions on his household arrangements were as welcome as Lord Saval's poetry, which he had read and found wanting. She pressed her lips together to contain something that was half outrage and half startled laughter. I like your father, she said, before she could stop herself. Cale looked at her with those serious gray eyes. He likes you too, he said, with the simple, devastating certainty of a child reporting an observable fact. She opened her mouth and closed it again. He asked Gregor about you, Cale continued. After the first day, Gregor told me. Gregor tells me things he thinks I don't remember because he forgets I have very good ears. What did he ask? She kept her voice very level. Whether you seemed content here. A pause. And whether you had enough blankets. The snow came down between the bare branches of the pear tree. Somewhere in the keep, a door opened and closed, and the distant sound of the Lord's voices rose briefly, and then was muffled again by stone. Hazel sat in the cold with the Alpha King's son, and felt something she had no safe name for settle in her chest, like warmth in a room that had been cold for a very long time. It was only later, walking back through the servants' corridor with her cloak damp from the snow, that she heard the voice, low, male, carrying the particular carrying quality of someone accustomed to being heard in large halls. coming through the gap of a door left insufficiently closed. "The Omega woman," the voice said. "The healer. I've seen her with the boy." A second voice she did not know. "Careful ground," the first voice continued, and she recognized it now. Lord Seval, the one from Kale's story, the one who asked unwelcome questions about mates. An Omega with daily access to the child and the ear of an unmated king. That is either very useful or very dangerous, depending on which side of it one stands. "You think she has ambitions?" "I think ambitions are the least of what she might have." A pause, heavy with implication. "I think she should be looked into, carefully, before the solstice." Hazel stood very still in the corridor. Her heart was beating faster than it should. She made herself walk on, steady and quiet, giving nothing to the cold stone walls around her. But she did not sleep at all that night. The summons came the following morning, and it did not come from Xander. A Gamma guard appeared at the door of her small room before she had finished braiding her hair, his expression carrying the specific blankness of a man delivering a message he had not been asked to understand. Lord Seval requested the presence of the healer in the Eastern Receiving Hall. Not suggested, not invited. Requested, in the way that powerful men used the word when they meant something closer to commanded. Hazel finished braiding her hair. She straightened the laces at her collar. She picked up her healer's satchel, because she was a healer, and that was what she carried. And it reminded her, and anyone watching, exactly what she was and why she was here. Then she followed the guard through the keep's corridors with her chin level, and her breathing controlled. The Eastern Receiving Hall was a long, cold room with high ceilings and a fireplace that was more impressive than functional. The kind of fire built for appearance rather than warmth. Two lords sat in chairs that had been arranged with careful deliberateness. Lord Seval at the center, a lean man of perhaps 60 winters with silver hair and eyes the color of old pewter, and beside him a younger Lord Hazel did not know, broad-shouldered and watchful, who said nothing throughout what followed. Lord Seval looked at her the way people looked at documents they expected to find irregularities in. "Sit," he said. She sat, because refusing would cost her more than it gained her. "You are the Omega healer, Hazel, from the lower village." "Yes, my lord." "You have been attending the young Lord Kale for 6 days." "Yes, my lord." "At the king's direction." "Yes, my lord." He let the repetition sit in the air between them for a moment, as though giving it time to sound suspicious. "An unusual arrangement," he said. "A hedge healer, an Omega, from the village, with no formal training in a recognized healing house, given access to the king's heir." He tilted his head. "How did this come about?" she told him. Simply, exactly, without embellishment or defense. The market courtyard, the child in the cold, the cloak, the story. She left nothing out because omissions, she had long understood, are what people find. She gave him the whole clean, unadorned truth because it was the only version of events that had no seams for him to pull. Seval listened. His expression did not change. "And you had no prior knowledge of the child's identity," he said when she finished. "None. And no one encouraged you to approach him." "No one knew I was going to. I did not know I was going to." She kept her voice level. "He was a cold child sitting alone. That was sufficient reason." A silence. "Sufficient reason," Seval repeated, and made the words sound like a foreign phrase he found quaint. "You are very confident for an Omega healer." "I am truthful," she said. "I find it is sometimes mistaken for confidence." The younger lord by the fire made a sound that might have been a quickly suppressed laugh. Seval's eyes moved to him briefly, sharply, then back to Hazel. "I will be direct," Seval said. "The king has been without a mate for 5 years. He has a young heir who requires a stable household. There are noble women of appropriate rank who have waited with patience and dignity for the king's attention." His voice took on the particular smoothness of a man making a threat that he prefers to frame as concern. An Omega hedge healer from the lower village, however kind her intentions, is not a suitable permanent fixture in that household. I would encourage you to remember where you come from, and what is appropriate. Hazel looked at him. She thought of Cale under the pear tree saying they look at me like a problem to be solved. She thought of Xander at the window saying I was not taught how to help a child who sits alone. She thought of a carved wooden wolf, and a question about blankets asked through a door to a man who would remember it. I am a healer, she said quietly. I came here to help a child sleep and eat, and feel less alone in a large cold keep. I have done that. I have not done anything else, and I have not wanted anything else. She met Saval's pewter eyes without looking away. If that is a threat to your plans, my lord, I think you should examine your plans. The silence that followed was very long and very still. Then from the doorway behind her, a voice. Lord Saval. She did not need to turn to know. The quality of the silence in the room told her. The way all the air rearranged itself, the way Saval's spine straightened involuntarily, the way the younger lord came to his feet. She turned anyway. Xander stood in the doorway of the eastern receiving hall with Gregor 2 steps behind him, and the expression on his face that she recognized now. Not cold, not cruel, but sealed in the specific way of a man who has heard enough and has made a decision and is now simply executing it. I was not aware, he said, stepping into the room, that my healer had been summoned to account for herself. His voice was conversational. The conversational voice, she was learning, was the one to be most careful of. Saval rose. My king, I was simply... You were interviewing a member of my household without my knowledge or consent. Xander crossed the room at the same deliberate pace she had come to recognize, unhurried, because he had never needed to hurry, because the world waited for him and not the other way around. He stopped beside Hazel's chair, not in front of her, beside her. That is not something you were simply doing, Saval. That is something you were specifically doing. I had concerns. Your concerns regarding my household arrangements were addressed last year, Xander said, and the flatness in his voice then was absolute, the kind of flat that has no floor. I recall informing you that they were as welcome as your poetry. The younger lord by the fire was definitely not smiling. He was working very hard at it. Saval's silver composure held, but thinly. The stability of the succession is my concern. Xander turned his pale eyes on the older lord, and whatever Saval saw in them made him stop speaking mid-sentence. Not yours, not the council's, mine. A pause, during which the fire crackled and the cold room felt somehow colder. You will extend my healer the courtesy appropriate to any member of this household. Is that understood? Yes, my king. Good. He glanced down at Hazel, just briefly, just a look, but it carried in it a question and a steadiness together, checking without making a show of checking. She gave a small nod. He looked back at Saval. The council reconvenes at midday. I suggest you use the remaining time to reconsider which concerns are worth bringing to that table. He did not wait for an answer. He stepped back toward the door, and Gregor was already holding it, and Hazel rose from the chair and followed because there was nothing else to do, and the door closed behind them, and they were in the corridor. He did not speak immediately. They walked, as they had walked before, along the northern corridor with its valley windows, and the snow was still coming down outside, thicker now, turning the world below into a soft white erasure of detail. Hazel kept her breathing steady and her hands quiet at her sides. You should have sent word to me, he said finally. I didn't know you were going to be listening at the door. The shadow of that almost smile. I was not listening at the door. Gregor was listening at the door. He is considerably better at it than I am, and less conflicted about it. She felt something loosen in her chest. I handled it. You told him his plans needed examining. They do. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. Outside the window, the valley was almost invisible now behind the white curtain of falling snow. only the faint dark shapes of the village rooftops showing through. Hazel. He said her name the way she had said Cale's that first day, like it deserved space in the air. I need you to understand something. She waited. When I asked Gregor whether you had enough blankets, he said, and he looked at the snow, not at her, which she understood was the only way he could say this. It was not because I view you as a servant, whose comfort is a logistical matter. The snow fell. I did not know what else to ask, he continued, quiet and precise. That would not overstep what I had any right to say. She thought about this for a moment. This large, sealed, careful man who made carved wolves when he could not sleep, who told his son that a tree that looks dead is not gone, who used the only language available to him even when it was inadequate, because inadequate language was still better than silence. You could have asked directly, she said softly. I am asking directly now. She looked at him. He was looking at the snow, but she could see his jaw, the old scar along it, and the slight tension there that she had come to read as the external evidence of things he was managing internally at considerable effort. Then I will answer directly, she said. I have enough blankets. I am content here, and I would like to stay. She paused. Not because of the keep, or the council, or anything that Lord Seval would recognize as a reason. She looked at the snow as well, because it was easier that way, because some things are easier when you are both looking at the same neutral third thing. Because Cale needs someone who sees him. And because... She stopped. Because? Very quiet. Because I think you do too. The silence stretched long and careful between them, fragile as the ice that forms on still water at the beginning of winter, present and real, but asking to be approached gently. Then Xander turned from the window, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her that first moment in the market courtyard, across the crowd, the look she had not known how to hold then. She held it now. He reached out slowly and took her hand. Just that, his fingers closing around hers, warm and deliberate. A choice made openly in the full light of a snowed-in morning. Stay, he said. The Council of Eastern Lords departed 4 days later, Lord Seval among them, his silver composure intact and his plans quietly, thoroughly unmade. Gregor saw them off at the main gate with the professional courtesy of a man who felt no obligation to seem sorry about it. The solstice came, as it always did, turning the longest night into the first breath of the returning light. Cale stayed awake to watch it from the inner garden, bundled in a fur-lined cloak that was warm enough for the occasion, sitting between his father and Hazel on the stone bench while the stars came out one by one above the pear tree's bare branches. He fell asleep before the midnight bell, and Xander carried him inside without waking him, and Hazel walked beside them through the torchlit corridors of the keep, and felt, for the first time in 23 years, that she was walking toward something rather than away from it. Spring came slowly to Varenhold, the way it always did in the northern reaches, grudgingly, in small increments, the cold retreating by degrees. But it came, and the pear tree bloomed. Cale found it first. On a morning in early spring when the frost had finally loosed its grip on the inner garden, and the air smelled of thawed earth and new grass, and the faint green promise of things waking up. He came running, actually running, the way he had never run since Hazel had known him, with his dark braids flying loose and his face broken open into an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy. To find her in the corridor and drag her by the hand to see. The tree was covered in white blossoms, delicate as breath, trembling in the mild morning air. Xander was already there. He stood at the center of the garden looking up at the branches, and when he heard them coming through the archway, he turned, and the expression on his face was something she had never seen there before. Open, unheld, the face of a man who had stopped bracing for the cold because the cold this morning was simply gone. Cale released her hand and ran to stand beside his father, and the two of them stood together under the flowering tree, and the look that passed between them, wordless, complete, was the kind of thing that cannot be manufactured by duty or performance or the careful management of appearances. It was simply true. Hazel stood in the archway and let herself look at them. Let herself feel the morning sun on her face, and the smell of blossoms in the air, and the particular, unmistakable quality of a moment that is whole. Xander looked over at her. He held out his hand. She crossed the garden. She took it. They were wed before summer. Not in the great hall with its noise and its watching lords, but in the inner garden, under the pear tree that had learned not to look dead anymore, with Gregor as witness, and Cale standing between them, with his carved wooden wolf in one hand and his free hand tucked into his father's, his face wearing the solemn, shining expression of a child who has gotten the thing he did not dare ask for directly, but had been quietly hoping for with every piece of his careful heart. There were no lords invited, no political theater, no audience arranged to satisfy the watching world. Only the four of them in the morning light, the king, the healer, the child, and old Gregor, who recorded it in the keep's ledger in his angular handwriting and said nothing whatsoever about it, and who was observed by the kitchen staff to be in an unusually excellent mood for the remainder of that week. Hazel moved from the servants' wing. Petra came from the lower village to visit, looked at all of it. The keep, the garden, the king who stood when Hazel entered a room, the boy who had started laughing at mealtimes, and said, in a tone that made it mean its complete opposite, "Nothing, you said." She was still smiling when they walked together through the village that afternoon, and the two of them were still the same as they had always been, moving through familiar streets with the easy companionship of women who had shared cold mornings and thin blankets, and the particular warmth that comes from choosing to look after each other without being asked. Lord Saval received word of the marriage by courier several weeks after the fact. His response was not recorded. His poetry, Hazel was told, had reportedly worsened. Cale outgrew the servants' bench in the lower hall and began eating in the great hall again, but at a smaller table near the window, where the light came in, and the noise was less. And no one looked at him like a problem anymore, because the people who had done so were no longer welcome in Varenhold. He kept the carved wolf on his bedside table. He asked Hazel one evening to teach him the rest of the Silver Wolf story, the parts she had not yet told him. She told him it was finished. That was all of it. The wolf, the river, the summer song. He considered this. "Then make up more," he said. So she did. She told him new chapters, slow and quiet, in the evenings when the fire burned low and the northern wind pressed against the shuttered windows of the keep, and the wolf in the story grew over time, as all things do that are given warmth and patience and space enough to become what they were always meant to be. And in the keep of Varenhold, in a kingdom that had always been ruled by cold and power, and the long, hard logic of who was stronger, something quieter and more durable took root. In a garden, under a blooming tree, in the simple and complete space between two people who had each learned to stop waiting for the world to be different, and had simply, finally, chosen each other instead.